What's up, miniature painters? Today we're going to paint Elkthorn for the Dragon Eclipse board game. This sculpt is so interesting and dynamic that it's the most fun I've had painting a single miniature since I painted Tsathoggua for Cthulhu Death May Die. As such, I spent a little more time on this piece than normal, and most of that extra time was spent painting Elkthorn's skin. For the skin painting portion of this video, I'm going to use about 4 minutes of footage from my Fantasy Flesh recipe video, where I demonstrated painting those skin tones on Elkthorn here. So if you've already seen that video and you're comfortable painting Elkthorn's flesh, you can jump straight to everything else using the timestamp down below. So without further ado, let's get to painting Elkthorn. And welcome to Treehane Miniatures. As usual, I'm going to begin with a model that has been prepared with black primer. From here I apply a base coat of dark plum over all of the skin. I'm also covering all of the foliage on Elkthorn that makes up his clothing. I'm always surprised at how bright this paint looks when going on the model, but rest assured, this paint looks much darker when dry, as we'll see at the beginning of the next step. Also, don't let the fact that I'm painting an anthropomorphic deer creature dissuade you from using this recipe on your more humanoid characters. This is more of a human or elven flesh recipe, but I just really wanted to paint this Elkthorn character. It's my first time painting a miniature of this quality and I'm loving it. It's resin, so there are no gaps, no seams, and no mold lines anywhere. I'm completely sold on resin now. And now we can see how much more subdued this dark plum looks when dry. For the next layer, I'm going to add a little elven flesh to the dark plum. This is a secondary shadow color that will be added everywhere but the deepest recesses. I'm even adding it to the downward facing area such as the chest and abdominals. However, on these downward facing attributes, I'm just hitting the most raised portions of the muscle to build some definition here, because on the abs in particular, there won't be much in the way of highlights going forward. Even at this early stage, I'm already beginning to draw my brush strokes toward the light source. I want the light to be coming from the model's upper left, so each stroke will be drawn in that direction where possible. Each color that I add to the model will be applied in a couple of thin layers, covering a little less area with each layer. This will work to create some smooth transitions from the darkest shadows to the brightest highlights. For the next layer, I simply add a little more elven flesh to the dark plum. This is beginning to create a pleasing tanned flesh tone. What I really appreciate about this recipe is how the hues move from violet shades to browns and finally to some yellow skin tones. The yellow tint of the elven flesh mixes with the violets in the dark plum to perfectly move through these color transitions. I'm not entirely sure, but I believe that this is where the new Army Painter Fanatic line would fail. I fear it would take this dark plum paint into the bright pink range. I'm noticing so much more desaturation with the new Fanatic line of colors, like the Army Painter is adding more white to their paints. They do have much better opacity, but noticeably less saturation. Anyway, this layer is where all of the muscles begin to take shape. I begin each stroke in the shadow area and follow through all the way to the brightest part of the muscle. Each muscle will be highlighted up to the point where it meets the muscle above. This means that the brightest part of one muscle will be adjacent to the deepest shadow of the muscle above it. We're building the foundation for our future highlights with this, but the application of strokes still don't need to be too technical at this point. I'm using pure elven flesh now to move us further into the highlights. This is where I find the process to begin to be more enjoyable. I'm working with more precision here, but since I need to cover a much smaller amount of real estate, the painting moves along briskly. I'm still highlighting toward the light source and highlighting each muscle up to the point where it meets the muscle above, but now my application of paint is a little more technical. I'm applying the paint with short strokes that run perpendicular to the length of the muscle. As we reach the end of the highlighting phase, our final brush strokes may remain slightly visible on the model. These perpendicular strokes will sell the idea that the light is interacting with the surface of the skin rather than it looking like the little line of paint that it actually is. I'm taking a little more time with the skin on this miniature because I want it to be the focal point of the piece. Also, this is my first time painting a finely sculpted resin miniature and I want to savor it. The total amount of time spent painting the skin on Elkthorn came in at right around an hour and 40 minutes. Now this is a significant amount of time for me, considering I usually try to spend just 3 to 5 hours painting a single miniature like this. Now we move on to our typical final highlight color. I prefer ice yellow for this, but almost any bright off-white color will work here. I have this ice yellow well thinned with water so that I don't overpower the previous layers with the stark contrast of this near white paint. It's a lot safer to apply the paint in thin, translucent layers and build to a full opacity on only the smallest and brightest of areas. I'm primarily focusing these highlights on the upper left side of the model, like the left forearm and Elkthorn's facial features. With so much time and effort put into the skin, we're going to settle down now and take a more relaxed approach to painting the rest of the model, while still trying to maintain a consistent overall appearance for the piece. I feel it's good practice to be a complete tryhard on at least one aspect of every model that I paint, and in this case it was definitely the skin. On other pieces, I may choose non-metallic metal, fire OSL, or anything else that strikes my fancy at that time. For the antlers, I'm going to begin with a solid base coat comprised of a 50-50 mix of dark plum and Vallejo whole red. I'm also going to use this on all of the wooden components of the base and on Elkthorn's forearms. The following progression of colors for these various attributes are all going to be a bit different, so for now we'll just focus on the horns. Before beginning this step, I took a moment to hold Elkthorn under my desk lamp to get a good idea of where the light would reflect on these antlers, and now I'll make a quick sketch of these highlights with some Army Painter necrotic flesh for reference. This underpainting sketch will remain slightly visible under the subsequent layers until I'm finally ready to add the highlights. There's nothing neat or pretty about this sketch because it will be all covered up when we're done. I add whole red to all of the upward facing areas of the antlers, allowing the darker mix of whole red and dark plum to remain as a shadow color. The whole red is thinned with water to allow for smooth blends with the previous layer, and it still allows our light sketch to be easily readable. From here, we're going to add necrotic flesh to the whole red and begin placing our highlights. We're going to use our initial sketch as a guide to create these highlights, but these darker highlights will cover a significantly wider area than our initial sketch. Once these are in place, you may not be able to see the initial sketch any longer, which is fine. From here, we just need to refine the highlights within this established area. I continue this progression by adding even more necrotic flesh to the whole red. This is the last layer that includes whole red, and I build up the highlights by covering less area within the previous layer. This mix is still thinned quite a bit with water, so it achieves a smooth transition between layers. I use necrotic flesh on its own to create shiny highlights on the most raised areas of the rack. I usually try to create this shiny effect by drawing short strokes that run perpendicular to the length of the reflection. In other words, it's made up of a series of dashes and dots that are placed across the short width of the highlight rather than painting one continuous line that runs along its length. For the final highlight, I jump straight to pure ice yellow. The highlights are further accented following the same principle that I used with the necrotic flesh. However, the ice yellow is used much more sparingly within the necrotic flesh highlights. Now I'm going to take a little break from the intensity of painting the main character and quickly knock out the base. I start this by base coating everything that isn't wood with Necromancer Cloak. I don't need to obsess about getting this into every nook and cranny, since a little black primer will make a fine ultimate shadow color for the mostly gray base. I'm keeping the base super simple and unremarkable by adding a simple dry brush of uniform gray by the Army Painter to wrap up all of the stone. When painting sculpted bases, I usually try to keep them somewhat understated so that the painted character remains the star of the show. All of the branches on the ground get hit with a heavy dry brush of oak brown, which is over the existing dark plum and whole red base layer. I also use this to swipe some color across Elkthorn's hairy back. A mix of oak brown and ice yellow finishes up the base with a quick dry brush over all of the deadfall. And just like that, we're back to the Elkthorn character. I don't want Elkthorn's wooden bracers to look exactly like the tree bits that are on the ground, so we're going to hit these first with a coat of whole red. This is a very forgiving application of paint, since I want the previous shadow color of dark plum and whole red to remain visible in the recesses. To further differentiate these bracers from the branches, I'm going to use sulfide ochre to build up the yellow highlights. First, I add this to the whole red to create an initial highlight color. Then I use sulfide yellow on its own for the final highlight application that hits just the most prominent edges on Elkthorn's wooden cuffs. This sulfide ochre is also used to highlight the little bit of fur on Elkthorn's back. Let's begin painting the pseudo-clothing on Elkthorn's torso with a mix of green and dark plum pro acryl. Heavily textured surfaces are not my favorite things to paint, but they sure are fast and easy to paint. I'm using a pretty heavily loaded brush for this, and I'm looking to cover almost all of the dark plum. I can apply this paint very aggressively and not worry about obscuring the deep shadows because of just how recessed the textures are. The deep shadow color will remain visible unless I intentionally force the paint deep into the crevices of the foliage, which I have no intention of doing here. I continue the layering progression with green pro acryl. My brush is once again pretty decently loaded with paint, but I'm just allowing the raised surfaces of the leaves to catch the paint from my brush. I'm no longer attacking the texture with the brush, so it's more of a subtle approach. Now I'm beginning to build towards the highlights by focusing my layers on the upper left side of the model. Bright green pro acryl is the next logical color as we continue to develop these highlights. The application of paint is more subtle here as I begin to target individual leaves to highlight. It's still not too meticulous, but I want to be careful not to cover all of the green paint that came before. Our next highlight is made up of a 50-50 mix of bright green and pale yellow pro acryl. Now I'm using small lines to highlight specific parts of individual leaves as well as adding edge highlights. The left shoulder gets a little more attention than the briefs or the right shoulder, and I'm leaving a large portion of these areas untouched so that the highlights stand out more. Finally, I'll use pale yellow to brighten the leaves in a few select locations. These are tiny dots and lines placed mostly on edges of the leaves. I need to place these highlights very sparingly so that the foliage still reads as green. I don't want to wash out the vibrant green color too much with the very desaturated yellow paint. With the bulk of this project out of the way, we just need to wrap up a few of the minor details. So now we're going to paint Elkthorn's nails, nose, and left eye. To start, all of these features get a base coat of Payne's Gray Pro Acryl. Then the nose, and the nose only gets a little splash of Iron Wolf by the Army Painter. This will build up the highlights gradually and thus give it a little less sheen than the nails will have. Next I use Wolf Gray by the Army Painter to highlight the nose and nails. The nails in particular get a very fine highlight that runs along the upper ridge of the nail. This large jump in value will help sell the illusion that the nails are very shiny. The nose gets a highlight along the top and on both sides. The last step for these features is to use Vallejo Glacier Blue to add a little glint of light to the left eye. We'll add a fine line highlight on the upper part of the nails on Elkthorn's right hand, and I'll dot in a couple of extreme highlights on the nose. And we've saved the best for last. I'm going to use some matte white acrylic paint and a little red acrylic ink to paint Elkthorn's glowing right eye. First, I add some flow improver to the matte white paint on my palette. This allows the paint to flow much easier off my brush. The main advantage with this is that I can get the paint into the deep recess of the eye glyph without having to brush it into place. I can just touch my brush to a location on the Mini, and the reduced surface tension of the liquid will allow it to wick into the sculpted recess around the eye. Next, I'm going to glaze some red ink over the white that I just painted. You can glaze this into place with a standard brush, but I'm choosing to use an airbrush for this step. If you don't have an airbrush and would like to see how I paint glowing red eyes using only a standard brush, you can check out my Eclipse video right here. I'm getting just enough cover so that the red still looks bright, but doesn't appear pink. With this red in place, I'm going back in with the white and paint the specific areas that I want to be the source of this red glow, like the eyeball and the deep curl in the lower part of the glyph. Then I simply use fluorescent red ink to glaze over these white bits with a standard brush. And that's all that there is to painting Elkthorn for the Dragon Eclipse board game. If you'd like to add a blue OSL effect to your Elkthorn miniature, then check out this video here, where I demonstrate 3 different ways to add OSL to a fully painted model, including the exact method that I used on this Elkthorn miniature. Thank you so much for watching. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to join our growing community of painters.